Prologue. The pride of the forest. Long before it tasted the dust of Jerusalem, long before it was stained with the blood of a king, the wood was merely a seed. It fell into the rich, dark soil of the Judean hills, nurtured by the gentle spring rains and the fierce summer sun. For decades, it grew. It stretched its roots deep into the rocky earth, finding living water hidden beneath the surface, while its branches reached upward, as if trying to brush the very hem of heaven. It grew into a magnificent cedar, tall and unyielding. The tree possessed a silent, steadfast pride. It watched generations of shepherds pass beneath its shade. It listened to the wind howling through the valleys, standing firm against the tempests. In its heart of sap and rings of time, the tree harbored a quiet dream. It believed, as all great things do, that it was destined for glory. Perhaps, the tree thought, it would be felled to become the central pillar of a great synagogue. Perhaps its wood would be carved by master artisans, inlaid with gold and ivory, to form the doors of a high priest's palace. Or perhaps it would be fashioned into a magnificent altar, upon which sweet incense would burn as an offering to the Almighty. It was strong, it was tall, and it was waiting for its sacred purpose. But the ways of the world, and the ways of the divine, are rarely what we expect. Chapter 1. The Fall and the Silence. The day the woodsman came was not a day of glory. There were no royal trumpets, no master architects inspecting its grain. There were only rough men with calloused hands, smelling of cheap wine and sweat, carrying heavy iron axes. They did not admire its height. They only saw utility. The first blow of the axe sent a shudder through the tree's massive trunk. The pain was absolute. Blow after blow, the iron bit into its flesh, tearing through the rings of its history. Finally, with a deafening groan that echoed through the hills, the great tree fell. It crashed to the earth, its branches snapping, its leaves crushed into the dirt. Its dignity was stripped away in an instant. The men hacked off its majestic branches, leaving behind only a naked, scarred trunk. Chains were wrapped around its circumference, and it was dragged unceremoniously by beasts of burden down the rocky mountain paths. It was thrown into a dark, damp timber yard on the outskirts of Jerusalem, piled among hundreds of other felled trees. Here, the wood waited in the silence and the dark. Years passed. The wood dried, its sap hardening, its vibrant green fading to a dull, ashen brown. Master carpenters would occasionally walk through the yard, running their hands over the timber. They would look at this particular log and shake their heads. Too many knots, one would say. The grain is too stubborn, too twisted for fine carving, said another. It was rejected for the temple. It was rejected for the palaces. It was deemed unworthy of beauty. Left in the corner, forgotten and dismissed, the wood grew hard, heavy, and deeply bitter. It was no longer a proud cedar. It was merely a stubborn, ugly piece of timber. Chapter 2. The Roman Order. In the bustling, tension-filled city of Jerusalem, a carpenter named Ezra worked in a small, dusty shop. Ezra was a quiet man, burdened by the taxes of Rome and the sorrow of seeing his people oppressed. He made his living crafting simple tables, chairs, and yokes for oxen. But occasionally, the Roman garrison in the Antonia fortress would issue a requisition. It was an order no carpenter could refuse, though every Jewish carpenter dreaded it. One brisk morning, a Roman centurion stepped into Ezra's shop. His armor clinked, a harsh sound against the quiet scraping of Ezra's tools. "Carpenter," the centurion barked. "The prefect requires 3 crosses by tomorrow morning. Sturdy ones. We have executions on the eve of the Passover." Ezra's heart sank, but he nodded slowly. "I will have them ready." When the soldier left, Ezra walked with a heavy heart to the local timber yard. He needed wood that was cheap, heavy, and strong enough to hold the weight of a dying man. He didn't need beautiful wood. He needed brutal wood. His eyes fell upon the forgotten cedar log in the corner. It was thick, gnarled, and covered in rough bark. It was perfect for an instrument of torture. Ezra paid a few copper coins, loaded the heavy log onto his cart, and brought it back to his shop. Chapter 3. Shaping the Instrument of Death. The shaping of the beam was a violent process. Ezra did not use his fine chisels or his delicate smoothing planes. He used his heavy adze, hacking away the outer bark, striking the wood with forceful, angry blows. The wood felt the violence of its transformation. It realized, with a deep, silent horror, what it was becoming. It was not going to be an altar of life, it was going to be an altar of death. It was being fashioned into a patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam that a condemned man would carry to his execution. Ezra left the wood rough. There was no need to sand down the splinters for a criminal. The rougher the wood, the more pain it would inflict, satisfying the cruelty of Roman justice. When Ezra finished, the beam was heavy, jagged, and ugly. It was a curse made tangible. That night, lying on the stone floor of the carpenter's shop, the rough-hewn beam seemed to radiate a cold dread. It was an object of utter despair, destined to be soaked in the blood of the guilty, destined to hear the final, agonizing screams of a thief or a murderer. Chapter 4. The Courtyard of the Praetorium. Before the sun was fully up on Friday, Roman guards came and dragged the 3 beams away. They hauled them to the stone-paved courtyard of the Praetorium, the headquarters of Pontius Pilate. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and impending violence. The courtyard was in chaos. A mob was outside, screaming with a ferocity that shook the stone walls. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The rough-hewn beam was dropped onto the bloody pavement. From its place on the ground, if Wood could see, it would have seen a man being dragged into the courtyard. The man was unrecognizable. He had been scourged until his back was a landscape of open wounds. A crown of twisted thorns was forced into his scalp. He was trembling, bleeding, and gasping for breath, yet there was a strange, terrifying silence about him. He did not curse his tormentors. He did not scream in rage. A guard kicked the rough-hewn beam toward the man. "Pick it up, King of the Jews," the soldier sneered. The heavy, jagged wood was violently thrust onto the man's torn shoulders. The beam was incredibly heavy, weighing perhaps 100 pounds, but its true weight was something entirely different. It felt as though it carried the weight of every lie, every murder, every betrayal, and every sorrow that had ever existed. The rough, splintered wood dug mercilessly into the open wounds on the man's back. The beam expected the man to curse it. It expected the man to hate it, just as every condemned criminal had hated the wood that carried them to their doom. Instead, the man's bloody hands reached up and gripped the rough wood. He embraced it. He held it not as an enemy, but as a terrible, necessary burden. Chapter 5. The Via Dolorosa. The journey began. The path from the Praetorium to the hill of Golgotha was steep, winding, and crowded. This was the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. With every step, the rough-hewn beam ground into the man's flesh. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a suffocating haze. The man staggered. The beam felt the terrifying weakness in his legs. Suddenly he fell. The heavy beam crashed down upon him, driving him into the cobblestones. The wood crushed his neck and shoulders, a brutal, unforgiving weight. The guards whipped him, forcing him up. He rose, trembling violently, and took up the beam once more. His blood began to soak into the rough grain of the wood. The beam, which had once been fed by the pure rain of the hills, was now drinking the blood of a king. He fell a second time. The weight was impossible. The beam felt the man's heart hammering against his ribs, a failing rhythm. It felt his sweat, his tears, his exhaustion. The wood itself, in its silent consciousness, felt a strange, profound sorrow. It was the instrument of this innocent man's destruction. The Roman guards, seeing that the man might die before reaching the execution site, grabbed a bystander from the crowd, a man named Simon from Cyrene. "Carry it," they ordered. Simon took the back end of the beam. The wood felt the difference. Simon carried it with dread and reluctance, trying to keep it away from his own clean clothes. But the man with the crown of thorns continued to bear the front weight, leading the way, staggering ever upward toward the place of the skull. Chapter 6. Golgotha. They reached the top of the barren, wind-swept hill. The vertical posts were already driven into the ground, standing like dead, leafless trees against the darkened sky. The beam was thrown to the ground. The man was stripped naked, his wounds reopened as his garments were torn away. He was violently pushed down backward, his bleeding back meeting the rough, splintered surface of the beam. Then came the iron. The heavy mallet swung high.
Clang.
The massive iron nail pierced the man's wrist, tearing through flesh and nerve, and buried itself deep into the rough-hewn beam.
Clang.
The second nail was driven into his other wrist. The wood held him. It gripped the iron tightly. It was intimately bound to his agony. Ropes were attached, and with a sickening jolt, the beam, and the man attached to it, were hoisted into the air and secured to the vertical post. For 3 hours, the beam held him suspended between earth and heaven. It felt every agonizing gasp for air. To breathe, the man had to push up on his nailed feet and pull up on his nailed wrists, scraping his torn back up and down the rough, splintered vertical wood. The cross was a machine of slow suffocation. The sky began to darken, though it was only midday. A heavy, unnatural shadow fell over the earth. The beam felt a tremor in the air, a spiritual gravity that made the very rocks beneath the cross groan. In the darkness, the beam heard him speak. He did not curse. He spoke words of unimaginable weight. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And finally, with a loud, tearing cry that seemed to split the very fabric of the universe, "It is finished." The man's body went limp. His head bowed. The agonizing tension in his muscles released.
He was dead.
As he breathed his last, the earth violently shook. The rough-hewn beam shuddered as an earthquake tore through the bedrock of Golgotha. Chapter 7. The Stained Timber. Hours later, the crowds had dispersed. The Roman soldiers broke the legs of the thieves on either side, but seeing that the man in the center was already dead, they pierced his side with a spear. Blood and water flowed out, splashing down the rough wood, soaking into its deepest fibers. Gentle hands came in the twilight. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus carefully, weeping, pulled the nails from the wood. They lowered the lifeless, battered body. The rough-hewn beam was left behind. It stood alone on the dark hill, covered in dried blood, sweat, and tears. It had fulfilled its terrible purpose. It had been the instrument of the ultimate murder. It believed, in its silent wooden heart, that it would forever be cursed, a symbol of supreme shame, a monument to human cruelty. It waited on that hill through Friday night. It stood through the silence of Saturday. The wind howled around it, mocking its ugly, bloody form. But then came Sunday morning. Epilogue. The Tree of Life. As the first rays of the dawn pierced the Sunday sky, a tremor of a different kind swept through the earth. A light burst forth from a tomb not far from the hill, a light that swallowed the darkness whole. The rough-hewn beam remained on the hill, but something began to change. News spread through the city, carried on the wind, spoken in hushed, awestruck whispers. The man who had died upon its rough wood was no longer dead. The tomb was empty. Death had been defeated. And in that cosmic shift, the meaning of the rough-hewn beam was forever transformed. It was no longer an instrument of torture. The blood that had stained its rough grain was not the blood of defeat, but the blood of the ultimate sacrifice. The cross had become the bridge between God and humanity. The wood realized its destiny. It had not been chosen to adorn a palace or to hold up a temple roof. Such things were temporary. They would eventually turn to dust and ruins. Instead, this flawed, naughty, rejected piece of timber had been chosen to hold the Savior of the world. Because of its roughness, because it was despised, it was perfectly suited to bear the suffering of God Himself. Through the centuries that followed, empires would rise and fall. The palaces of gold and ivory would be looted and burned, but the symbol of the rough-hewn beam would endure. It would be carved into stone, painted on grand canvases, worn around the necks of millions, and planted on the highest cathedrals. It was a reminder that God does not always choose the polished, the perfect, or the proud. He chooses the rough, the broken, and the rejected, and transforms them into vessels of his ultimate glory. The rough-hewn beam, once the ugliest thing in the world, had become the tree of life.